All right, good morning, and thank you for coming to this 8 a.m. session of Out of the Lab. So this is like sort of an inside the actor studio presentation for a prominent social psychologist to be interviewed by former students. And so I'm very excited today to introduce Dr. Brian Nosek, Dr. Colin Tucker-Smith, and Dr. Kate Ratliff.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, hi, this microphone, I think I can hear it, so great. I'm gonna do a little bit of an introduction, then we'll go to questions, and we also are gonna take questions sort of from you all as you have them. You don't have to wait till the end. It's gonna be a little bit chronological in order. Well, it's gonna be chronological in order, the way that we sort of present the life of Brian. It's a good start.
Good movie, yeah.
Thanks. I didn't even script that one. So rather than sort of holding to the end and it being anchored by whatever we were talking about at the end, if you have a question about sort of that life stage, like you can come up to the microphone. Okay, good morning. On my handwritten notes with coffee stain as an academic does. And also for those of you watching in the future, it's 8 a.m. on Saturday of SPSP, right? So in case I look tired, it's because of that, not because this is the 20th anniversary of my first SPSP. Right. And also to the friends from last night who said they'd like to be here. But it's 8 a.m. on Saturday. I see you, I don't see you, and I see you. So thank you. Just want to give that, for the people in the future, in your afternoons, we're here at 8 a.m. Okay, good morning. So I'm very honored and slightly terrified to be presenting my mentor, Brian Nosek. Kate and I were his first grad students. Started our PhD in the fall of 2003. Brian was then in his second year as an assistant professor at UVA. He got his undergrad degree at Cal Poly in psychology with minors in computer science and women's studies, which he combined really well in his master's thesis, at Yale, which was titled Gender Differences in Implicit Attitudes Towards Mathematics. His first JPSP, this math equals me. Okay, I can't do don't do anything that you haven't memorized. Math equals me, I don't equal math, so I don't know. It's something. Nice try. That's the look, I can't look.
I've seen that look a lot of times.
What is this guy mumbling about in my office? Okay, moving on to my notes. Right, so he finished his PhD at Yale with Mahzarin Banaji, then went on to UVA, where he's been for just over 20 years. Around the time of getting to UVA, he co-founded Project Implicit with Mahzarin and Tony Greenwald. That's a research website you might have heard of. It's been incredibly impactful. It's won the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Golden Goose Award in 2018. It's won SPSP's Service to the Field Award in, I think, 2020. And then it's gotten no backlash from anyone. So that is good. He also co-founded the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science and the Center for Open Science, which he currently directs. So if he looks tired, that's because he does too much. He's won, among many other awards, Early Career Award from ISCON, an award for distinguished service to the field from SPSP, honorary doctorates from the University of Bristol and Ghent University. I didn't know that our field got honorary doctorates, so maybe other people do. I thought one was amazing, but that's a very cool thing. And his work has been cited more than 100,000 times. He has somehow maintained his humility with all of that. Whatever humility he had, he has maintained that level of humility. He really just wants all of us to be better, which he's been telling me personally for 20 years.
I really want you to be better.
I know. That really is my morning mirror talk. So anyway, thank you for being here for this conversation. Yeah.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, super impressive. Congratulations on being interesting enough to be interviewed in this out of the lab session. So I guess we're going to kind of start at the beginning. So to understand, how you've gotten to this place, why don't you start by telling everyone a little bit about your entry into social psychology? How'd you get started?
Sure, and thanks for coming. I went to Cal Poly for computer engineering and spent 3.5 years doing that. And at some point felt like, well, maybe I should have some easy classes to take as a break from the real engineering classes. And so I started taking psych and women's studies classes. And my grades in engineering just started to decline because I was spending all of my time thinking about the psych and women's studies courses. And there's a paper that I distinctly remember just then becoming obsessed with psychology. And it was by Tony Greenwald and Anthony Pratt-Canis and somebody else. And what they had done was looked at the effectiveness of subliminal self-help tapes. This was the rage at the time. This was, mid-early 90s. The idea was you put this tape on for improving your memory or improving your self-esteem while you sleep, and it has very nice music and very quiet messages in the background that would help you improve self-esteem or memory. And they were very popular. And so the paper said, well, we're going to evaluate this. And what it did was it randomly assigned people to either listen to the memory tape or the self-esteem tape. And then it also added this randomization of what the label on the tape was, either matching what the tape was actually supposed to improve or the other label. So it was, I either was actually getting a memory tape, but thinking it was self-esteem, or it was also said memory. And I was just blown away by this design. Like, this is amazing. And I mean, the outcome is no surprise to anybody, right? The tapes were not effective, and people thought they were effective but depending on the label. Oh yeah, I feel like I have more self-esteem. And then actual performance was not changed. So they measured actual self-esteem and they measured actual memory.
So wait, your first favorite paper was a null effect?
It was a total null effect. That's great, I didn't realize that.
Here we are.
So that's good. But what it captured was just the sense of, oh my gosh, you can do science on people. The power of randomization was totally obvious, right? You give people this tape or that tape, and you measure their outcomes. The randomization of their expectations was like, oh my gosh, so people believe this one thing, but this other thing was actually supposedly happening. And then the measurement both of what they felt changed and what actually changed. And all of that in one design, to me, was just like, this is the coolest, like, how could we not do this? This is how you figure out the truth about things that we believe. And so that was just inspirational as a method and a way of starting to think about science of human behavior, which I just had not appreciated how important or relevant that was. And just as a relevant aside, Tony Greenwald, I ended up collaborating with a lot over the years, but this was just my first exposure to work that he had done. And I visited a friend in Seattle a year or two later, before going to grad school, and sort of trying to figure out, how do I get into this field? Because I never really understood how to get actually into the field of social psychology. But I felt like I need to go meet this guy. I'm in Seattle, he's at the University of Washington, so I guess I should go talk to him or something. And I was totally terrified to do that, but it felt like that I have to do that. I have to do it.
Rightfully so.
Right. Yeah. Well, I didn't know I was supposed to be terrified because of him. I didn't know who he was, but I was terrified about the concept. And so I, found his office in the psych department, and I was like actively shaking, knocking on his door, and I had no idea what I was going to say. Oh, I love you, Tony. Your study's so cool. I had no idea what I was going to say, but he never answered the door. He might have been in there, but he didn't answer the door. And I was so relieved, because I was like, oh, okay, I did the thing to try to get into the field, and I didn't have to actually do the thing, that whatever it was going to be. So that was just a pop-out memory. But once all of that happened, I was like, I'm going to do this. This is what I want to do.
And then how did you get from Tony's paper as your inspiration to Mazarine? I mean, that's a pretty direct connection, but you figured that out.
I did not know it was a direct connection.
Okay.
So I didn't apply to University of Washington to work with Tony. I don't know why. I applied to schools where it looked like they had funding for grad students, but I didn't really know how to search for that. So I applied for a weird mishmash of schools. And the So the lack of socialization was, I got lucky. Many people don't get lucky through the lack of socialization. But one of the things that I sort of figured out during the application process was that it might be a good idea to actually reach out to faculty that you want to work with. But I was too nervous even to email people. Like that felt like a big hurdle. And so I put off, I put all the applications in, I put off emailing people, and then finally in like January, and the admissions cycle, January is kind of late to be doing your first outreach to a faculty member. But I said, I have to email her. So I got myself over that hump and sent her a short email, just saying I'm applying and this is what I'm, this is a little bit of my background, just wanted to say hello. And then that evening, she called me and I was like, oh, this is Mahzarin Banaji. I'm like, oh my God, what's going on? And she said, well, I appreciated you sending the note, but I wanted to let you know that your file had already been put into the reject bin. Like, oh, great, thanks for calling. Yeah, that's nice.
Did that really need a phone call?
She just wanted to rub it in, right? And she said, but the reason is that none of your reference letters were in the file. And so can you get your reference letters so we can consider it in the short list? Like, because the meeting's tomorrow. Oh my God, yeah. So, I'm calling all of my my undergrad mentors and having them fax the letters to her. And she, and then, it was quiet for a few days. And then I was actually had graduated in the December, and I was just taking a stats class at UC Davis, my hometown. And I came out of the class and my dad was standing outside the classroom. I'm like, that's weird. He's like, Mahzarin just called again. Okay, I'll go home. So I went home and she said, well, it came too late. We had already made our rankings, but I took your file and I walked it around to each of the members and had them re-rank, and we've admitted you. I was like, oh my God, that's great. So it changed everything. But for me, the lessons were, there's a lot of random moments, those small things that feel big, but are small things, sending an email. If I hadn't sent the email, none of that would have happened. And if I hadn't sent it that day, if I waited one more day, she would have just not even responded. And then the other thing that's why she was motivated to do all of this was not because my application was incredibly special in the record. It was, I'm a computer engineering major who switched to psychology. And Mahzarin's lab was psychologists who that year were trying to learn how to program because all of the new tools that they were building required developing them in software, and they were having a terrible experience with it. So she was sort of like, you know what, I need someone who can program. And she saw my email and she said, oh, you might be able to program. So is that random chance of two different things having completely changed trajectory for me to get into grad school.
It's great. And it's funny that you talk about being unsocialized into the field, because I feel like you, no offense to the other students in your lab, because maybe they don't feel this way, but I feel like you have, you've chosen people for your own lab, I think, who are relatively unsocialized. I mean, Colin and I both went to small schools. We didn't know what we were doing when we applied, and so.
This is my only suit.
Yeah, I mean, at least for me, it felt a little bit like, like you took a chance on us, I think. And maybe that comes from that experience of you being, unsocialized.
There are so many benefits that people have in research institutions to become knowledgeable about how the process works, to get involved in research in a way that the structure, that the system just doesn't allow for people that are in different kinds of environments. So that really, it's true for me, a criterion in the admissions process was not so much, have you been doing it in the right place? It's what are your interests? And how is it that in the place that you are, how have you developed those interests?
Right, yeah. So speaking of developing interest, did you start working on Project Implicit while you were in grad school? Was that was sort of the beginnings of the Project Implicit endeavor, was during that time?
Yeah, so I got to grad school in fall of '96, and the website was built on fall of 1998, so at the end of my second year. But getting there, so there's an interesting origin story in that, which is just how we got to building the website, which started with sort of the awakening of what the reality of science is when actually in grad school, from the idealism of entering grad school, right? We just design these experiments where we find out the truth and we just share it and everybody talks about it and all that's all great. But I took Alan Kasdan's research methods course, and the course, this was, like spring of first year or something like that. And what the main themes in his course were reading papers that are about fundamental issues in how it is we acquire knowledge. And so we would read Jacob Cohen's work on power, Bob Rosenthal on the file drawer effect, Tony Greenwald's paper on prejudice against the null hypothesis, Paul Meehl on theory construction and the weaknesses of psychological theories. And these were pointing out sort of fundamental problems with the credibility of the literature in ways that were stunning to read. Like Tony's paper, Prejudice Against Null Hypothesis, you should read it if you haven't. It's published in 1975. Sort of just says, look, just based on people's decisions about whether they report a null result or not, we can estimate that 30%, not 5%, 30% of the published literature are probably false positives. There was not, p-hacking was not part of that story. It was just publication bias. That was mind-blowing to read that and say, oh my God, our literature is not nearly as credible as we think it is. And it's simultaneously mind-blowing to read it that I'm in now late 1990s, and these are papers, Cohen paper, 1962 was the original power paper, 1975, Rosenthal's 1979. These are now 20 to 30 years old, these papers. And we're reading them and they're immediately relevant today. And the stunning part of that, to me, was the recognition, and to our cohort, was we know about the problems. All of these papers, at the end, say, here's all the solutions. This is how we solve this. And nothing had changed in 30 years of knowing those things. And so we would, like I think many graduate cohorts would, after, at the end of the week from these classes, we'd go to Anna Liffey's down the road, which had free wings, and so I would eat my dinner of having free wings, and we would talk about how could we fix this system? This is craziness. And all of the solutions that are part of the solutions, like I'm sure many different conversations among grad students have occurred over the years, which are things like, we really should decide whether to publish something before we know what the results are. So why don't we have a peer review process that is about the design and rather than the outcomes? And then we wouldn't have publication bias because we would have done that. All this sort of stuff. Why don't we share more data, blah, blah, blah. But just wasn't happening. Anyway, I'm taking a long time on this story to get to Project Implicit, sorry, but it's heading that direction. So the recognition from all of that and among our cohort was, well, we can't solve the system problems. That must be why this isn't changing. We can't change power of designs in general. We don't have the mechanism to do that, but we can work on the quality of our own work in light of understanding issues of low power and prejudice against null hypothesis, et cetera. So how do we do that? And the one that was most tractable in the moment was power. Our sample sizes are too damn small. How do we solve it? And the first solution was to go to the beach. Peter Salave's lab, the students that were in it, were doing research on sunscreen and whether people would use sunscreen or not and how to encourage health behaviors through different messaging. And so they were going to go to the beach and ask people on the beach to use sunscreen, sort of a field experiment.
Because your participant pool at Yale, I remember you saying, was like 80 people a semester or something like
80 was the good semester. Okay. In the spring, I got 15 participant hours. It's like 15 participants. What am I going to do with 15 participant hours? And so the beach was like born out of necessity. If I'm going to do more than a third of a study, we need to do something else. So we set up a tent, we bought a big cooler of sodas, and we partitioned it into 4 little mini lab rooms. And like a dozen grad students were there, and we were running experiments in each of these little labs. People would walk up and get a Coke for doing a study. So we got 400 people in a weekend. Like, this is amazing, right? Of course, the data was all sandy and everything, but it was still, we were getting data. But that clearly was not scalable. And so the next solution was this tool that we're using, the Implicit Association Test, is super interesting to do, right? Just performing it is interesting. When my first trip back home to visit with my friends, I had made decks of cards for the IAT and different variations of names and terms and everything else. And my friends we all gathered at a coffee shop, and we spent 4 hours sorting cards and debating of what does this mean, and let's do it this way, and what if I do this one first and then that one? And they just had a blast. And I was like, oh my God, people enjoy doing this. They learn about science doing this. They think about randomization and all of those things that subliminal messages paper, right? That's part of the experience of doing the test. So we should make it available to people, and maybe we'll get some interesting data.
Right. And how many times do you think you've answered that question about order effects in the intervening time?
Oh my God, yeah, it's the age of the question to answer. So I had a computer engineering background. I was like, the internet now is this thing, so maybe we can put it on the internet. And so I started to pitch to Maserine and Tony, saying I could build this website so that people could come and do the IIT. I didn't know if I could build a website, but I was like, I'm sure I can figure it out. And they, sort of again, I just would bring it up every once in a while. We could do this, let's try it. And then finally, this is a nice insight about Tony, is he said, okay, I've scheduled a press conference in 6 weeks, go build the website. Oh my God, okay. So I didn't sleep for 6 weeks. I lived in the lab trying to build this thing. I was like, I've never programmed in Java. I kind of know some HTML. Oh my God, what am I gonna do? So, and it didn't work. The website didn't work until we were on the way to the airport, like leaving for the airport, because the press conference was in Seattle. And it worked. So, and then it went.
And then it really worked.
Yeah,
like, it really worked.
Surprisingly so. Yeah. That was not expected.
This is a side story, but I remember first year of grad school, we were in the same office. There was about 8 of us in the office, and we had sort of different styles of interacting with Brian. And Kate would come back from her meeting, and I would be ready to go into my meeting. And I would look at her and say, what did you tell him you know how to do today? Just be like, oh yeah, you need to do SEM. And you're like, and you just be like, yeah, okay, great.
Sure, I'll do that.
And be like, oh no, what's SEM? I need to learn this by next meeting. And we did. So it's sort of a family thing that we've learned to just say you know how to do it, and then figure it out, and then do it, and live in the lab, and yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, and there's a general sense of the empowerment of action, like we can build solutions. There are these problems, there are these challenges, but it's just a matter of figuring out the solution and then building it. Then we can do it.
That's great. And it seems so like, I think Project Implicit seems so amazing now and so obviously a benefit, but my recollection is that at the time when you went on the job market, people weren't like that super impressed, right? There was some sense of like, okay, you built a website, like how is this psychology, or like what is this, right?
Right, oh yeah, it was actively not psychology. So the Maserine would get sort of back channel feedback from people in evaluating applications just to understand how I was being viewed. And they said, well, he's your techie. That's what he is. And so why would we hire a technical person for a psych job? So that, obviously wasn't true universally. Did manage to get a job, but doing things out of the expected norms comes with its own set of risks that, just being eyes open about is like, well, if that's what you want to do, do it, but recognize that it is outside the norm and what is expected.
And then UVA decided to hire you, so it
Yeah, well, they
worked
decided to
out.
hire Bethany. my
Despite
spouse.
you falling asleep in the lobby during your interview. I love this story.
That is true, yeah. Yes, so the anxiety of the job market was high. And I interviewed at Wisconsin a year prior and did get that job after throwing up in the bushes on the way to the interview. But
Causally.
yeah, right, that was a causal. I told everybody, yeah. But the challenge there was I got that job and it was a very weird set of timing circumstances, but they decided not to hire Bethany. And of course, she was devastated, feeling like she's ruined my opportunity for a career. But Wisconsin was very generous in saying, well, it's a little late to get started, so you can defer for a year. And we said, and we just kind of have to see what the options there are for both of us, because there's two of us. And Madison didn't have a lot of second options for Bethany. And so we were back on the market, and she got every job there was. And I did not get an interview. And so now I'm feeling like, oh my God, I've ruined her career. But she got the offer, she got multiple offers, and the place that was willing to take a step was Virginia in bringing me out, even though there was a freeze, because they really, really wanted Bethany. And I was still super anxious because now the pressure's on, and I didn't sleep the night before, and went downstairs to the lobby and sitting there waiting for Stacy Sinclair to come pick me up, and I fell asleep. And so she had to come and wake me up for my job interview. Brian, time to be interviewed. I said, oh, no, okay, yeah, no, I was
dreaming?
Just closing. That's right. Luckily, Stacy's so easygoing that it was like no big deal. Anybody else comes, I would have, like, it would have been over, but she was very generous. So that was great. Yeah.
Do you have any questions? We can pause here. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? Before we switch to talking about, once you've gotten a job and you're setting up a lab, what was that like? But any questions up to this point? Do you have any questions?
I do not.
Okay. All right. So you talked about sort of being skeptical of the social system of the field when you were a graduate student. And then you got to UVA and you had the opportunity to kind of set up your own lab and kind of make your own micro social system within that. We were obviously there for the beginning of that, along with a couple other people. And it's funny looking back on that because, now we're considerably further advanced than you were at the time. And so it's interesting to think back and to think of like what you were going through at that time, right? Like we were kind of self-focused and we were like, oh, we're grad students and we're new and like this guy knows all these things. But you were a brand new assistant professor setting up a lab. What was that time like for you?
Fantastic. It was just that open opportunity of creating an approach that was how I wanted to do research.
Yeah.
And having the freedom to do that. Mazarine was an exceptional advisor and very generous in allowing that, but now it was all on me, right? I was reliant on her in so many ways. And as a grad student, even in an early career, like emailing her constantly, what do I do with, oh my God, what do I do with, what's gonna happen here? And that support was essential, I think, for me to sort of feel grounded and like I can do this. But having the freedom to define this is how we're going to do the work in the lab was exciting. And, still those papers and the challenges for the field from the Kasdan's class, were fully incorporated into, I want to try to do this the way that that our ideals are. Like, that's how I want to do it. And so, made the lab website and immediately would say, well, we'll post drafts of papers on our website. The preprints wasn't really a thing in 2003, but we'll put them up there. Maybe people will be interested. Put all of our materials on the personal website so that people could access those. When Dataverse was created at Harvard, Gary King's group, in 2005, I signed up for an account. I think we were the only lab, it was an individual lab that had an account on Dataverse for sharing
We
data.
were.
Yeah.
We were the only lab.
And it's just like, well, we're going to do these things. This is how we're going to do it. And we're going to see what happens. And people say, oh, you can't do that. And well, we'll try it. We'll see what happens. And even in grant applications, so the first major grant was R01 from NIH, I had built in, it was to support Project Implicit's continuing development. And I built in a postdoc position where the rationale was, we're generating so much data. Thousands of people are coming to this website. This data could be used for more things than what our lab could do. So the postdoc's job will be to prepare the data for sharing so other people can use it. And NIH made me cut that position. People don't share data. Why would we bother with that? So it was pulled out right from there. But it was, it was that luxury of being able to start and do things in different ways was great, really fun.
All right. And now what? We have 40, I think we're at 40 million data points now from Project Implicit. I think this year,
bananas.
there are probably people here who would know better, but I think this year we hit 40 million, which is it's a lot of data.
Yeah. So the other thing that comes to mind about early parts of the career, I'm curious about your experiences with it, is taking the Kasdan course, and I taught them the research methods course for our department, and used the same articles, and then also started to incorporate things like David Sears' article about relying on college student samples and the challenges for generalizability, Norbert Kerr's Harking paper, so there's just there was the bits and pieces of the methods challenges, and just that research methods class was so important for me to sort of clarify what the issues were. And it was so interesting in the working with the students through that material, because from that course, I would have students every year, a student would come to me and say, I need to talk to you about an issue of what's happening in my lab. And they would describe, p-hacking, didn't have the terminology. One example was at a lab where the PI, they were doing correlational study, but they wanted to test for moderation. So there's 3 variables, and really any one of them could be the DV, any one of them could be the IV, and one could be the moderator. And so they just analyzed it, every combination, and looked for the one that was significant, and that's the one that became the paper.
Yeah.
And the student was like, this feels weird, from what we were talking about, how do I deal with this? And so it was sort of this growing realization of, oh, wow, this stuff is playing out in reality in ways that we're not seeing easily in the published literature, but are there in our labs, in our experiences. So I'm curious if your experience in the pre-crisis, whatever.
Right.
And the BEM paper would say, well, I was just polishing the jewel or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, you got to make a nice story. Like, you got this jewel, like make the right setting for it. And we're many of us were sort of taught, like, that's what you do. Make a nice story for people. Like, you've got the data. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very boring to tell us what you were thinking all along. Right? Yeah. So that was sort of part of the discourse. I feel like you talk about sort of the luck of things and where you end up in all these decisions. I feel just like incredibly lucky that I ended up in that lab at that time, so that for me, it was just ingrained in the way that we thought. Like in that methods class, like the Harking paper was obviously the better one than the BEM paper to the way that we were just talking about it, I think. And I don't think that was necessarily the case of many people at the time. And so we always get
even
this
among
thing.
your cohort, there was debate.
Absolutely.
About BEM versus Kerr.
Absolutely. And it just, to me, it felt obvious and right, but that wasn't everybody's experience. And so I do sometimes get this annoyance when people say, well, that's how things were at the time. Well, Tony's paper is from the 70s, like we should have known. It was either a little bit of like willful ignorance or something. Sometimes it feels like not everybody we should have known better, possibly. I don't want to get too preachy, but maybe we could have known better.
Yeah, and I mean, I resonate with that in many ways. And simultaneously, one of the things, I think the false positive psychology paper is rhetorically the best paper ever written that I've read, because what it did was address that exact issue of, I don't think it was willful ignorance in large part, unless you're really deep into the methods stuff. Rather, it's hard to see how the methods stuff translates to my own behavior. And what that paper did was trace the path of those actions that you're doing in your everyday work, which feel very ordinary, feel like discovery. This is the implications for how it is that they mislead you. And it just hit that mark so clearly, inescapably, that it was hard then to be blind to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think maybe I've heard you talk about this before, so I'm not coming up with something new, but I do think that there is like an interesting commonality between your work on implicit bias, like as a topical area, and then your sort of open science kind of work, right? There's like some common theme of like people with generally good intentions behaving in ways that sort of unintentionally reinforce behaviors that they don't necessarily want to reinforce. And it's like there are these two, on the surface, like totally different areas, but I do think that there's sort of a common thread of like intentionality that kind of goes through both of them.
I feel that resonance very much and what I often describe as the way I would characterize my interest is the gap between our values and our practices, right? And what are the ways we can address that gap so that we're living according to the ways we desire to live, we want to live, we idealize living. And the open science stuff just feels like a practical application of that basic research interest where implicit bias and a lot of the morality and politics stuff too fit into that of where is it that our values are aligned with our behaviors and not.
It's interesting. Okay, so we left the lab in 2009. It was obviously, in the ways that we've talked about, like pretty forward thinking, I think, at the time. But then by 2013, the Center for Open Science was open. So like, it seems like a lot of stuff happened between those years, right?
Yeah.
Like, what was the impetus for the center, and like, how did it all happen? You just promised something, and then all of a sudden you made it happen.
Right. Well, it's like that old aphorism of incrementally and then all at once.
Yeah.
In that a lot of the things that we were doing in our research group were sort of setting the stage for that to be possible. Not that I was imagining that we would start an organization at all. It was not in my 5-year plan.
Of course you have a 5-year plan.
It kept changing, but you have to have a plan, right? And then you benchmark against it, and then you adapt based on the current reality. As we all do. You don't have a 5-year plan? All right, we'll talk about that later. But for the renewal of the NIH grant, the first one for Project Implicit, I was working on 2 different grants. You were still there, so it was 2007, 2008, where one was proposing to build what was called then the open source science framework. And the idea was we can make a lot more of the research process transparent and accessible to others. We can make some tools to make it easy, and then people will know and be able to reuse the materials and blah, 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 blah. And the other one was for what was called the International Participant Pool. And the idea was, do you remember this? Yeah. The idea was we need to deal with this representativeness problem. And a lot of times we have research questions that really aren't fit for our participant pool. So what if we merged all the participant pools together, and then you would get credits for adding participants from your pool, and then you would spend those credits to extract samples that you need for your research. And it didn't get funded, but MTurk came along not long after. So it was sort of like, okay, well, that sort of addresses what we were trying to do. Yeah. But neither of them I could get funded. And primarily the open source science framework proposal got polarized reviews where some people would say, oh, this would change everything and we need this, and here's the problems with credibility that this would solve. And others would say, but people don't like sharing data. Why would we fund this?
A theme that has continued with your work, I think.
There has been that storyline, that's a thread. So I put those aside, but what started to build in the lab was a couple of things. One was I was able to self-fund a lot of the work in the lab by giving Project Implicit talks. Right. So corporate groups are interested in bias and decision-making, and so I'd go give a lecture. We set up Project Implicit as a nonprofit. They'd pay Project Implicit, and then Project Implicit would send the lab money. And that was how we funded our work. And so that provided some resources to do some things. And then the other thing that we had that was a real luxury was because Project Implicit was generating so many participants, a lot of the work that was happening in the lab would start with a replication. Here's this thing we thought was interesting. Let's replicate it, and then we'll build on it this way and that way and this way. Or we start with repeating it. And so many of those studies would end at trying to repeat it. And we say, oh my God, what's going on here? And of course, what the attribution was from when we send a note to the original author who said, oh, we tried this, and we couldn't get it to work again. They would say, oh, well, of course, you did it online. Research doesn't work online. Why are you doing that? And I said, well, but this other research works online. We're getting all these effects. We're just not getting this one. But it was plausible. We couldn't rule it out. Maybe it was because we were doing it online. I don't know. And so we started to do these projects in 2009, 2010, where we take the same study and we have three conditions. We have UVA undergrads come into the lab and do it, or go online and do it, and then Project Implicit sample and do it. Same experiment, and just to see, do we get the same kinds of effects? And we would get the same. And now doing it online, everybody says, of course you do research online. But yeah, we got the same kinds of effects. But we started to do it with classic studies, like framing effects, anchoring effects, all sorts of stuff. And that evolved into what became the Many Labs project, because it was sort of like, oh, we can do this comparative work across different kinds of samples. So we were doing things in the pre-everybody recognizing that these challenges were big, that really positioned the work to be able to act when them, Stoppel, and the false positive site papers all hit. Because then the context changed, right? The OSF proposal wasn't getting funded early because they're just, people weren't seeing the reason, the rationale. Right. But those papers opened up a new sense of, oh, there are issues to tackle here. So we were able to start saying, okay, we can lean into these things. We can start to do this work in ways that now had stronger relevance in the immediate context. Yeah. So we started the reproducibility project, saying maybe we can sort of get some interest in people replicating studies. Let's get some actual evidence of whether these concerns are founded. Jeff Spies, a grad student, said, you know what, I want to build the OSF for my dissertation. And so we took the Project Implicit funds and had just enough money to sort of get started on building that as a dissertation project. And all of that just sort of congealed into a set of activities. There was a call for special issues from the journal Social Psychology. And I said, I'm going to propose that thing that we talked about in grad school of doing peer review before actually running the study, and we'll report it regardless. And they accepted it. They said, yeah, that sounds cool, let's do it as a special issue. And that was awesome. And then it was very soon after, this guy, Chris Chambers, starts writing online that he's trying this thing called registered reports in the journal Cortex. And I'm like, that's the same thing. I was like, oh man, that's so great. And it has a name, and it's a really good name. So immediately started to collaborate with him on sort of like, how do we do this? And showed him what we were working on for the special issue. And so that kickstarted that. And so there's just all of these things that are sort of like getting pieced together into solutioning and building options and evidence gathering for the potential for making things happen.
One of the things that I'm sort of continually telling students, because I've gotten to a certain age now and I've sort of lived through this sort of revolution thing, like we didn't have this language when we were in grad school before this. We didn't talk about replication. We just talked about like doing it again. Or like, do you trust it? I don't know, let's do it again and see, like, I don't really want to talk about it until I'm sure, so like run it again. But we sort of thought in replicate, but we didn't have the words. We didn't have what to do. We just were sort of muddling through, and so people sort of born into the now time, that's the baseline. These words, the way to talk about it, to think about p-hacking, to think about researcher degrees of freedom, all of this stuff, it's now baked in, which is so much better. Like you can't even believe, well, from my perspective, it's so much better to feel like we have the language for it. And when we were doing these things, like we can say like we were replicating effects, but really we were trying to understand something that was cool in a paper that we'd read. We were like, how can we use this in our own work? Yeah. And it must have been very disorienting to the people we were reaching out to and saying like, hey, we can't get your thing to work. Like, what's going on? Like, I really want to use this, but it's not working. And they were probably like, oh God. But, because usually sort of people stayed in their lane and they had a thing that they did and they used that in their lab.
Right.
And we were like, really
much more.
Just we didn't have like a thing, like we were just very interested in like in some ways just sort of like, so I guess naively earnest. Like we just believed everything was interesting and we'd approach and go. And so it wasn't like, hello, I'm replicating your effect. It was like, I can't get this to work, like what's going on? And it just didn't have the language for that back then. So
But it was, you're right. I mean, it was extremely unusual, I think, to like reach out to people and say like, could I have your study materials? Or like, could I have your data? I mean, that was like almost unheard of at the time.
I remember your first year, Dave Hamilton sent you a box.
Dave Hamilton sent me a box of questionnaires.
That's great.
From his 1976 illusory correlation paper. I was doing a study trying to replicate it. I didn't call it that, but we wanted to see what would happen with implicit measures with that effect. And I didn't know what the actual items were because they weren't published in the paper, right? It was like we gave people these 72 or whatever behaviors, but it didn't say what they were. So I asked him if I could have them, but instead of just sending me one like questionnaire that had all of the items written down, he sent me a giant box that had everybody's questionnaires. So I got, I have like the first people who did the illusory correlation study, like I have those raw data, like in questionnaire form.
Probably an IRB violation, but it's fine.
Probably. I think they were anonymous, but
it's fine.
But that was so unusual. I mean, people just didn't do that sort of thing at the time. And you got some pushback, right, from lots of everyone, lots of people, senior people, less senior people. Because a lot of things happened at once. I feel like you and others were kind of pushing for a lot of different kinds of changes, like all at the same time. Like, was there something in particular that like created more pushback than others, like data sharing or doing replications, or was it just the whole thing was getting pushback?
No, not everything. So the idea of transparency, very few people said, no, that's a bad thing in science. Yeah. And I think there's an understanding that sharing transparency is part of how scholarship works. So the objections were not on the philosophical ideal, it was on the practical. Like, I mean, we can't do that. That's a huge amount of extra work, and we don't have the way to do it, and I don't know how to think about it. And so the pragmatics were really the barrier there rather than philosophy. But the replication stuff got real pushback because it felt like a threat, right? It wasn't just we're trying to advance knowledge, it's we're questioning the knowledge we already have. Like, what are you doing? And I think a lot of that comes out of very real concerns about what are the reputational stakes for the field if we lean into looking at this and we don't find that it's as robust as we might have imagined. And then what, right? Psychologists sticking its neck out compared to other fields. And that's risky. And so the pushback, I think, was not coming from places of bad faith at all. I think they were coming out of a set of concerns that, while I didn't share them, I had a different mindset about how one deals with challenge and much higher tolerance for risk. I didn't really realize how willing to fail I was compared to other people. Like, oh, yeah, we'll try this, maybe it won't work, whatever. And that made me much more oriented to, no, let's lean into it, let's figure it out. Yeah. And then if it becomes a problem, we'll deal with it. And we know it can. And so that was mostly the mix. And it was, in all variety of dimensions of people saying I'm ruining my career, and anonymous emails, all varieties of stuff, of concern about what happens next.
Yeah. Is there anything that you regret, or anything that you wish you had done differently at that time when this was all very new? And
not in terms of the approach, action of saying, let's look at these things. I felt like it was a principled reasons that I was going after it, and that mattered to me. And I tried to hear as much of the criticism as possible so that I could sort of say, do I need to change my expectations? Do I have the rationale wrong? So there was nothing in that I would change. Of course, tactically, lots of things went wrong. They always do. Everything I do, lots of things go wrong. And so I have plenty of regrets. Like, oh my God, why didn't I think of that? Oh, that was stupid. So that tends to be where, when I think back of, if I had only done that differently, or I've done that at that particular time, X, Y, and Z might not have occurred. But it really is on the process of how, rather than the what and why.
Right. Does the audience have any questions? Seems like a good time to see what others want to know.
Oh, the microphone right there.
Okay, so it seems like a lot of your programs and projects, like Project Implicit and the Open Science Framework, have solved a lot of issues, but it almost seems circumstantial that they came about, and almost happenstance. How do you find problems today, knowing what you know, and what's a problem that you're interested in right now?
That's a great question. For me, it is consistently about where are we not doing the ideal for what we would like this particular thing to be, either because we don't understand it enough, or because operationally, methodologically, we're not able to do it. And so I always start for myself with, here's the ideal world, utopia that we want to get to. We'll never get there, but I love having that as my benchmark for whatever problem I'm trying to solve. We'll understand reasoning completely if we do this. We'll solve all the methodological problems. We'll make everything equitable if we do it this way. And then figure out what are the practical steps from where we are today that can get me incrementally closer to that ideal. And the problem with that approach that I've experienced many times is that it evokes in reviewers, you're just a Pollyanna, right? You're talking about ridiculous ideals that it's not possible to get there. And I'm like, yeah, I know it's not possible to get there, but that's what I'm gonna try to do, because we'll get a little closer, and that's the goal, right? So that for me is, and this is sort of an abstract answer to your question, but that's how I think about what problems I get interested in next, what I want to work on. The one that is the next thing that is dominating my attention right now is something that proposed several years ago and couldn't get the resourcing to do it, but now I've got a couple of grants to do it, which is most of the work that we've done at COS is for the research producer. you designing your study, sharing your data, making it possible to do your work as effectively, as transparently as possible. The next phase is, how do we get the research producer and the research consumer to interact more effectively with each other, right? So that we have the self-corrective process of science really work. It's fine and great that we're all sharing things and making things more transparent, but if that doesn't turn into that self-corrective cycle of you being able to then critique my work, me having to then have a dialogue and that scholarly discussion that happens among us, really helping to figure out where the gaps are in the knowledge and where to do better, then we're not meeting the objectives of the social system of science. So the idea is to a new type of journal that really embraces that the scholarship is tentative, that it happens over a life cycle, that there should be interaction between reviewers in the general sense and the producers, and that it should be easy to revise it as you go. So you'll be hearing more about this because we now have funding to actually do a pilot of a new type of journal. But that's what I'm really excited about for the next phase. So thanks for the question.
And the rest of the field is like, oh no, that's what we're going to be doing in 5 years. Great.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll see.
All right, so it's interesting to think about kind of where you're going. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of your career in the sense of, you know, do you still think of yourself as a social psychologist? Is it a social psychology equals me situation? Is that still part of your identity? Or do you feel like that's not the case anymore?
I definitely still feel like a social psychologist, whether I'm perceived that way.
We'll allow it.
But thanks for asking. So I am still on the faculty at UVA. I've just been on leave for 10 years. And it is a very weird set of circumstances for why that has occurred that way. And we're back in renegotiating what the relationship is with the institution. But my core identity is very rooted in social psychology. And the way that I understand what I'm doing now is applied social psychology. Most of what the COS is about as an organization, and most of what the reform movement is doing in science, are social psychological problems. And I've said this in a couple of different places, but that original worry that people had about what the reputational stakes for the field were,
Yeah.
From my point of view, this was an opportunity for the field, not a risk. Because if there is a problem, we need to know. If our evidence is not as credible as we think it is, if we stay blind to it, the consequences long-term are much worse than actually figuring it out and starting to take steps to address it. We leaned into it, and other fields have the same kind of reward system and challenges, but we're actually saying we're going to take a look at ourselves. We're going to actually figure this out. And the community spirit around that in our field was amazing in lifting up the sense of we're interested in doing better. We want to see if we can do better. And then the solutions are all social psychological solutions, right? It's what is the system doing to lead us to pursue publication at the expense of credibility? How is it that we might adapt that so that we can align the goals that researchers have? Like, who gets into publishing, who gets into research because they like writing papers? Nobody. That's not a thing. Right? We get into research because we're curious, we like problems, we want to study things, we like the collaborative nature, all of the things that are about the work is why people are in the field. And yet the reward system ends up dominating because it's concrete. I need to publish in order to get a job. I need a job, I need to do these things in order to advance my career. And those rewards, if we can't align them with what it is that we are aspiring to do every day, then we'll always end up off the reservation with that gap between what we idealize science to be and what we do in our everyday work. And so that, all of that, everything about the system is a social psychological problem. And what has been amazing in the last, half of the existence of COS is that the rest of science or scholarship, I think, is recognizing these challenges in a new way and is realizing that psychology has stuff to share. We can learn from what it's doing. I was at a meeting at CERN with NASA. We have funding from NASA now, and regularly would come up with, man, we have a lot to learn from psychologists about how it is we can fix the reward system and make sure that our findings are robust. Like, that's pretty awesome to have that kind of engagement on the things that really we are the experts at. And we can first work on how it is we do our work, but then also share that and disseminate that with others.
Yeah. I think there's an audience question, if you want to use the microphone.
I really love hearing you speak about risk-taking, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you roll with failure, I guess, when it hits. And I think it's really valuable to hear people's failure stories as well as success stories. And maybe if there was a time where you had a really disappointing failure in the moment, but it ended up being one of the best things that could have happened in that scenario.
Yeah. And I hate failure, but I'm willing to fail. And that is, at least for me, is a combo that sort of produces the drive of trying, of, okay, this is a big problem, I want to try to solve it, and I'm going to go after it. And if I fail, well, I know I went after it. And that's the part that really matters to me. So what has helped me in those contexts is to be attentive to the authenticity of trying. Like, my intents are genuine here. People may be mad about it, people may not like it, people may show how what I did was terrible, but I know the value I apply to myself is through the intent and the authenticity of that intent. And then the outcomes are the things that I learn from. So a failure example is one of my absolute favorite papers, is Nosek and Hansen, 2008. Is this paper that addresses the fundamental debate in the implicit literature about, is it personal attitudes or is it cultural knowledge? And I think it's one of the best papers I've ever written. And I could not get it published in, I can't remember, I tried JPSP, I think 3 different times, different editors, and they let it go back in, and I could not get it through the peer review process. And this is immediately pre-tenure, and this was, to me, the signature paper that I had written. And it was so frustrating because it was risky in the sense of how I approached it, like all the theories in the discussion, and you've had this experience too. When you put the theory in the discussion, people at the time said, no, that should be in the front. I said, but we didn't have the theory at the beginning. This is a theory that emerged after we did the work, so we're putting it in the discussion. I didn't like that. I'm not gonna change it, goddammit. And so it ended up in Cognition and Emotion, perfectly good journal, but it felt like an injustice. My God, man, how could they reject this paper that's the most important paper I've ever written, whatever. The humility is coming through. It's good, yeah. In those moments of failure, I try to give myself the space to embrace the anger of that failure or the feeling of defeat. And I try to do that privately rather than to everybody else around me, and then figure out what is it that I can learn from that. And there was a lot that I learned from that particular experience of, it doesn't really matter where it gets published. The people that needed to see it saw it. People used it in their own work. It's gotten cited some, so okay, fine, move on and try the next thing. Thanks for that question.
Are there any other?
He's gonna
A
ask.
former student coming up?
He's going to ask if he's your favorite student.
He's going to ask who's your favorite student.
Well, I don't need to ask, because I know what the answer is.
Oh, good.
Okay, no, just kidding.
You're in the top 30.
Oh, great, great. I'll remember this on my deathbed. Okay, so one of the things that I'm curious to pick your brain on, because I felt a lot of turmoil about this when I'm thinking about what's happened over the past 13, 14 years. And for context, I started grad school the year before the reproducibility crisis began, is all of these different initiatives, some of which have been wildly successful, like sharing materials and so on. But one that to me has felt like it hasn't lived up to at least some of the initial promise or ideal has been with pre-registration. And I was especially disheartened by a recent paper finding that, well, first off, there's not that much standardization in how these pre-registrations are done, but then that a lot of times they're not even looked at in the peer review process. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, both in your position as an individual or through the Center for Open Science, the Open Science Framework, what do you see as the kind of future of pre-reg? How can we kind of get closer to the ideal of, having this kind of pre-commitment that people consider in light of the paper, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. So for me, it's the key is thinking about the behavior change process. Pre-registration is a big ask because it dramatically changes people's workflow. Sharing data is a lot easier by comparison. At the end, okay, I'll post the data or whatever. But pre-registration of doing the work to plan in advance, to do it well, is a lot of work. And so if we want to really give it a try and see if it improves research practice, then we need to start with as low a barrier to entry as possible so that you're interested enough to try it. Okay, let's try it. So on the very first versions of OSF, there was no structure around pre-registration. It was just like, put whatever you're going to put up there, whatever, and then just click the register button. And people didn't even click the register button because we didn't know how to do that yet. And they're terrible. The ones from our lab are terrible. Yours were terrible. We were all, yeah.
Is that what you were looking for?
It's because we didn't know what we were doing. We look at those first few that we did ourselves. My recollection of it is we would look at the pre-registration afterwards when we were getting ready to analyze our data, and we say, oh my God, we didn't say how we were going to exclude participants. Why didn't we do that? And, oh my God, we didn't do this. And so we were learning as we were doing it, which then helped inform the existence of templates and everything else. But it's hard. So to me, the goal of the initial phase of getting pre-registration adoption is really about getting people to try it. And we know it's going to be a mess. Right? We can anticipate that in advance because it's really hard. And we also have seen in the clinical trials literature the adoption of registration, and it's been required by law since 2000, and it's a mess. So if it's a mess and they have to do it, and it's been 23 years, 24 years that they've been doing it, why would it be different for us? So we can try to reduce the amount of time that it's terrible and improvable and everything else, but we have to go through that period of starting to do it, developing the capacity to do it, and then incrementally increasing the standards as people recognize the value and get facility, capacity to do it well without the dramatic burden. Because if we had imposed at the outset the perfect solution, right? This is that ideal from the real, right? You have to meet people where they are and figure out how do they get here, and then here, and then here. And we'll never get there, but we can, if we can get closer, if we really are attentive to the place that people are now. So I see lots of improvement happening in pre-registration. We have all of the experiences, all the research that meta-scientists are doing about it, feedback into our team to inform, okay, how could we design a solution to make that part easier? So outcome reporting, people aren't actually reporting against the pre-registration very clearly. Let's create a form that is identical to the registration for people to report, you said this, what happened? Said this, what happened? And maybe we can make that trivial for a reader to look at so they can see what's the same and what's different, what changed. And then just give the researcher the opportunity to explain why things changed. Okay, this is why it's different, this is why it's. So that iterative nature will, over time, I think, help to improve all of these things.
So I think that's a great stopping point, I think it gives us a bit of insight into the way that you solve lots of problems, not just the problem of pre-registration. So I think that we are out of time. I just want to say that I'm very grateful for you. I'm grateful for the support that you have given me personally over the last 20 years. And also for, bringing your idealism to the field and for what you've done for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.